I woke up suddenly, unsure if it was real. Then I remembered what that voice had told me, but my arm was bursting with pain. That's when I realized it was real. I had truly gone back to the past. At that time, I had been beaten by Belder's bullies, but now that wouldn't happen again. He was the most powerful dark swordsman in the future, but to understand how he returned, we need to see his final battle. A young man gasps for breath, clutching the hilt of his sword. He then declares they've finally made it this far, and if they could just defeat that enemy, they would win. But a sudden attack strikes him. A wound opens up on his chest. He looks down, wondering what happened to his body. Then he finally understands the situation. That was a decisive blow. In the end, he sees his own reflection, and he will be defeated without having accomplished anything. He opens his eyes one last time. One day, an unknown threat emerged and destroyed an entire continent. Humanity's arch-nemesis, the Liquidator. And the group created to protect humanity was assembled to face it. Among them was Brian Miller, the world's protective shield who survived a meteor without a scratch. And also the great sage Bella Albright, with power said to equal an entire division. There was the divine archer Jacob Bloomfield, who took down a high-level dragon with a single shot. And the sword Saint Amy White, the strongest to have ever existed. And then there was them, the members of the so-called support unit. But the soldier, Gray Lee, knew that in reality they were just sacrificial pawns. He recognizes that those people were on a whole other level. He knew that the graduates from the World Union Academy were incredible, but he never imagined the gap between them would be this huge. The combined attacks hit the Liquidator head-on. Lying on the ground, Gray wonders if their presence even matters. He questions if it makes any difference whether the support units are there or not. Meanwhile, he laments that they trained hard too. The enemy takes the Sword Saint's blow. The creature then observes the damage to its body. It faces the heroine, saying she hurt it, and that's alright. And then the Liquidator wonders if it should stop holding back. The Liquidator then prepares an area attack, and the blow hits all the heroes at once. It floats victoriously over the fallen bodies. Gray watches the scene from the ground. Then the enemy turns and asks if it was just playing around. He realizes they were all defeated with a single blow, while the opponent claimed to have been just having fun until now. The soldier reaches a conclusion. There is absolutely no way they can win this fight, and his body finally gives out. Then he wonders what's happening. He asks himself why he's still conscious, even after being hit by that attack. A distant voice tells him it has finally found him. Then another voice summons him, calling him the wielder of a great power. Gray gets up in an unknown place and asks if this is the afterlife, a rather barren one. He also notices something different. He then asks who the figure sitting on the throne is. The entity informs him that he was not defeated and that his physical wounds have already been healed. The young man stares at it without a word. He looks at his own body and asks if that figure healed him, but the entity denies it, stating it was Gray's own power. Then the young man questions what his own power is. The mysterious figure explains it cannot give him details, as it is unable to properly analyze that power, but it assures him that his power is stronger than the Liquidator's if he can control it properly. Gray then asks if this means they can win. The cloaked being replies that it doesn't know, but it also believes they must get rid of the Liquidator, and for that reason it reaches out and touches Gray's chest. Then it says the young man can go now. The entity states it will lend him its power. Gray wakes up on the battlefield again. A voice then says that this is his power and not a power that can be seen with the naked eye. Gray moves forward and states he understands, causing the Liquidator to react. He then strikes the enemy with a swift blow. The young man faces his opponent, and the Liquidator is surprised there is still someone strong standing. Gray comments that the attack seems to have done some damage. Then he prepares to strike again, and claims his power is stronger than the enemy's. But the Liquidator warns him not to be underestimated. The creature blocks the blow with its hand. The young man reacts, surprised by the defense. Then the Liquidator congratulates him for forcing it to use its full power. A dark silhouette appears behind the soldier. Gray manifests an even greater power, preparing for the confrontation. The Liquidator questions what that is as a barrier on its body begins to crack, and it asks if Gray is truly human. The two then charge at each other in a violent clash, and the impact of the collision throws the Liquidator backward. It gets up and asks again if the young man is even human, but Gray replies that's his question. A shadowy form glides across the ground at high speed. The Liquidator is surprised he's still alive, but Gray admits the enemy's strength shouldn't be underestimated. He takes a deep breath before continuing. Then Gray declares that he'll simply defeat him, no matter how many times it takes. He then charges forward and attacks with his blade. The blow hits the enemy, who calls him a monster, but the Liquidator begins to transform. He takes on a new form and prepares an attack. Under the moon, the creature announces that time is up. Gray is surprised to see the sky suddenly turn to night. He faces the enemy, and then challenges him, asking, "So what?" The young man attacks with a punch, but his blow is blocked. He reacts to the unexpected block. Then the Liquidator reveals that this is just the beginning, and that nothing can harm him in this plane of true twilight. The Liquidator orders him to stop his useless resistance and look at the stars. Then he asks if they aren't beautiful. Gray looks up at the sky. A pillar of energy descends toward the ground. The creature moves away from the impact site. The attack creates a gigantic crater in the landscape. He claims the young man won't be able to recover if he's completely defeated, but the Liquidator reacts as a different power manifests. A large clock materializes in front of him. The mysterious voice says the vast amount of gathered power will be enough to take him back. Then the enemy recognizes that power and calls him Kronos. Kronos asks if the wielder of great power can hear him, as he will use all his strength, and he will send him back to the past. The liquidator shouts his name. Kronos' voice says this is all he can do for him as the clock begins to turn. Kronos' voice then entrusts the fate of the world to him. Gray opens his eyes and finds himself lying on a lawn. He sits up and asks where he is. The young man observes the landscape around him. He turns his head to the side and recognizes his hometown, Renato village. But the village shouldn't be there, as it was destroyed 15 years ago. Then he remembers the words that would send him back to the past, and realizes it actually happened. A sudden pain hits his bandaged arm. He looks at the wound and recalls that back then he was being picked on by Belder and the others. He states that he can't let himself be defeated by people like them, but he admits they were strong and he couldn't beat them. He then sighs, thinking that defeating the liquidator was just a dream. So he decides he'll think about how to deal with them when he's stronger, as he doesn't want to get hurt. The young man continues on his way through the forest, but he runs into Belder and his companions. The aggressor says he's been looking for him and that he's caused him a lot of trouble. He then throws a sword on the ground and tells Gray to pick it up. The young man questions him silently. Belder tells him to stop playing dumb and challenges him to a training battle. Gray refuses the invitation, explaining that his wound hasn't fully healed yet. But the bully says not to worry, as the blade is dull and safe. Gray argues that no matter how dull the blade is, it's still a big piece of iron, and if it hits someone in the wrong place, the result could be serious. Belder slams the sword on the ground and tells him to shut up. He then asks if Gray thinks he has the right to refuse, and advances, saying that if he doesn't like swords, he might as well fight without a weapon. He wonders how this could be a training battle if he was unarmed. Then, he recalls the words of a military doctor, who explained that his difficulty with the sword was due to a childhood injury, and he realizes this might have been the start of his life as a loser. One of Belder's companions attacks him, but Gray dodges the blow. The young man reacts to the move he just made. Belder advances with his sword, but he dodges easily, noticing the opponent's strikes seem surprisingly slow. His feet move nimbly across the ground. He then realizes that wasn't quite it. Belder gets furious and asks why he can't hit him. The blade passes close to his face, and he understands that he was the one who had actually gotten faster. Belder's companions comment that the way he moves is like he's a completely different person. He kneels before the sword, stating that he may not have the body he used to have, but he still has the memories of the battles he fought. Belder advances with a vertical strike, but Gray parries the attack with his sword. He wonders if he can even fight an amateur like that. Then he remembers they were the ones who tormented him because he couldn't fight. Gray cracks a smile, and with a single strike, he disarms Belder, stating that things aren't the same anymore. The aggressor taunts him, thinking he doesn't even know how to take a sword strike. But Gray says not to worry, as they've just taught him a lesson. He holds the sword's hilt with both hands, and states that, as long as the blade is dull, it's a safe way to teach someone a lesson. Belder is surprised by a swift sword strike that flashes past him. He falls to the ground, hit by the blow, and wonders what happened. Belder stares straight ahead. Gray Lee stands over the fallen opponent while 3 other men watch from a distance. Then, Gray wonders if the blade wasn't dull. He checks the sword and confirms it's completely dull, thinking the outcome for Belder would have been much worse if the blade were sharp. Gray then faces his opponent and neutralizes him with a swift move of the blade. The blow knocks Belder down, and Gray decides he'll keep the dull sword. In front of Belder, Gray asks why he's screaming so much. He says someone told him a dull sword was safe. Then Gray asks if he wasn't the one who said that. Back in the present, Belder kneels on the ground, and he yells at his companions to stop staring and attack him. But the men comment that Gray's gotten much stronger and suggest they attack him together from behind. The 3 men rush to attack Gray. He then asks them if they want another round, and Belder shouts for his companions to stop him as they advance. Gray states he was going to let it slide, but he changed his mind. The scene shifts to the forest for a moment, and now the 4 men are kneeling on the ground, all defeated. Gray stands before them and asks if they're from the Saria Swordsmanship Dojo. One of the men confirms, saying they haven't been going lately because they feel strong enough. Gray concludes that while he shouldn't expect much, the dojo might be of some use to him. He then asks them to introduce him to the dojo, since entry is by referral only. But Belder asks if he can't ask someone else, as he can't imagine what his master will say. Gray simply raises his sword again, and asks if they should continue what they were doing. Belder immediately agrees to take him and runs off, pointing the way to the dojo. The group walks through the streets of a bustling city. Then Belder asks why he wants to go to a dojo, and Gray asks him if the place has a recommendation spot for the academy. Belder confirms he heard something like that, and Gray states that's why he wants to go. One of the men says Gray already seems strong enough without needing to go to the academy. Gray then comments that it would be nice if his current strength was actually enough. He remembers that not even the strongest group in the world was a match for the Liquidator, and even when he used that power, he couldn't even scratch him when he fought seriously. Gray wonders how strong he needs to be to defeat that thing, but he states it's not like there are no clues on how to do it. In that moment, he felt for an instant that he was able to control that dark power. He recalls that what he focused on was the swordsmanship taught by the sword master, the swordsmanship Amy White taught him. Gray concludes that if he had spent more time training under the same conditions as her, the result of that battle might have been different, and he believes that must be why Kronos sent him to this place. Saria questions what they are trying to tell her. She asks if they used what they learned to intimidate a civilian and ended up being defeated. The instructor of the Saria swordsmanship dojo glares at the group, but Belder tries to justify himself, claiming it was just a training battle. Then, with a swift move, Saria strikes all 4 men at once. Belder's companions are stunned by her action. She questions who gave him permission to make excuses and asks if what she just did was also training. With her sword pointed at his face, Saria orders him to leave and never come back. And she then informs them all that from this moment on, they are no longer students of the dojo. They agree and hastily leave the premises. Saria turns to Gray and apologizes for the trouble her former students caused. Kneeling, he tells her not to worry and thanks her. She then changes the subject, mentioning she heard he wanted a recommendation for the academy, and he confirms. As an apology, Saria says she would like to write the letter of recommendation, but she states that she first needs to confirm his skills, and Gray agrees. Saria offers Gray the first move, telling him to attack when he's ready. He then lunges forward with a rapid sequence of strikes. The two clash in a high-speed exchange of attacks. Saria carefully observes his movements. She comments that his swordsmanship is quite practical for his age, as if he's already been through countless battles. Gray is blocked by her sword. Saria dodges his attack and states that Belder and the others were no match for him. She notices his style seems self-taught, but his swordsmanship is similar to that taught at the academy. The instructor continues to block his attacks, noting that he has a lot of talent, but his technique is still raw, and defines him as a diamond in the rough. Then she decides it's time to end the fight. Saria braces herself and executes a powerful downward strike. Gray prepares to block the impending attack, and the two swords clash with great force. Saria presses the attack, forcing Gray back across the hall. She then finds the situation strange. The instructor wonders why he doesn't yield and can keep up with her movements, and questions why she's fighting with all her might when she just wanted to test his skills. Saria continues to wonder about that feeling. She then asks herself why she's so afraid of this boy. Then Gray leaps and delivers a powerful blow from above, but Saria dodges and comments that despite the bad feeling, it was just a wild swing. After the attack, Gray reveals an opening, and Saria claims he's finally shown his weakness. She moves in for a counterattack and declares the fight ends here. The instructor approaches with a determined look, but her expression changes to one of surprise. Saria wonders what just happened. Then she looks at her broken wooden sword on the ground. Gray realizes it's the same feeling as before and that he still has that power. Suddenly, Saria feels an impact coming from his direction. Energy bursts from Gray's leg. She walks over and asks what's wrong and if he's okay. Gray realizes his body couldn't handle the power he used, but he struggles to his feet and says everything is fine. He can barely stand and reflects that he shouldn't use that power carelessly. The young man then considers whether he should tell her what happened. Saria gives him a questioning look, but he decides it's better not to, as she wouldn't believe in something even he can't control. Gray just says he got a little carried away during training. Saria holds her own broken wooden sword, finding it impossible that this could have happened, and she's sure he realizes it too. Gray asks if something is wrong, but Saria can tell he's not going to talk about it. So she changes the subject and asks him about wanting a recommendation for the academy. He confirms he heard she could give him one. Saria says she can certainly recommend him to the best institution in the kingdom, the Royal Fencing Academy, but she states she can't recommend him for that school. The instructor then says he's not suited for that place. Gray lowers his gaze. He grips the hilt of his sword, acknowledging his lack of strength. Saria reveals that the place he should go is somewhere else. She suggests the World Union Academy, not the best in the kingdom, but the best institution in the world. The young man reacts with surprise upon hearing the academy's name. He remembers that's where the Sword Saint and other heroes came from. He wonders if someone like him could ever be accepted there, but concludes it's impossible. Saria then states that he has probably already realized his body is far from suitable for a swordsman. Saria explains that at the Royal Academy he might get by on his skills, but that wouldn't fly at the World Union Academy. She then questions how he acquired such technique with such a weak body, and Gray simply agrees. He knows everyone at that academy is a real monster, and that with a body like his, he wouldn't be able to compete. Then Saria asks him why he's giving up, reminding him there are still 9 months until the entrance exam. The young man reacts, saying it's only 9 months. She admits she won't say it's enough time, but Saria asks him to trust her. Then she asks him if he's ready to suffer for the next 9 months. Gray looks at his own hand and says he doesn't want to suffer, but he clenches his fist and declares he'll do it. The young man then asks her to look after him for the next 9 months. With a smile, Saria replies that was an excellent answer. She then cracks her knuckles, ready to begin. Gray is startled by her gesture. With a grin, she announces that his intense training starts now. The days fly by as Gray undergoes rigorous training. He is forced to eat strange meals and train tirelessly with Saria. The young man pushes forward with determination. 8 months later, Gray appears with a more defined physique. Surya approaches and comments that he's become much more muscular. Then she states she has nothing left to teach him and encourages him to move forward with confidence. He reminds her there's still a month until the exam, but she says it's better to arrive early to get used to the place. The instructor offers him a pouch with money for his travel and food. Gray asks if a month isn't too early, refusing to take the money. He then remarks that it seems like she's trying to kick him out of the village. Surya just replies that he's overthinking it. Then, she reveals she heard an ogre nest was found nearby, and the village has almost no guards. Gray confirms that he also heard about the nest's discovery, but she says it has nothing to do with them, as help will come from the royal capital and there's nothing to worry about. Surya encourages him to go to the exam without any worries. But Gray knows she's lying and that no help will come for the village. He remembers that his master will be defeated trying to face the ogre alone, just before the village is destroyed, so he just replies that he understands. The young man takes the pouch of money and thanks her very much. With a slight smile, he says his goodbyes and tells her he's leaving now. Surya watches him leave. Then she wishes for him to pass the exam. Under the moonlight, the night deepens. In the forest, there are traces of a previous confrontation among the trees. Surya analyzes the tracks, confirming the scout's report. She follows the tracks on the trail and states that her destination is just ahead. Suddenly, she looks up and asks where he's going. Sitting on a tree branch, Gray calls her master. Surya is surprised to see Gray. She asks why he's there instead of on his way to the academy. He jumps down from the branch and turns the question back on her, reminding her that she said the royal capital would handle the ogre nest. Surya explains they couldn't come because of an emergency, so she decided to deal with it herself. She confidently states that she's more than enough since she knows the nest's strength from the scout's report. The instructor explains that the chief is an elite ogre and the nest holds 40 to 50 monsters, admitting that the number of minions will be a bit tricky. Gray knows an elite ogre isn't that strong on its own, but he remembers the creature's true strength is its intelligence and leadership, and that fighting alone while surrounded by so many enemies is a dangerous situation. The young man is sure of one thing. If his master goes alone, she won't make it out of that fight and the village will be overrun by monsters. He saw this future with his own eyes, so Gray asks her to take him with her. Surya refuses, repeating that she alone will be enough. He insists he doesn't want to miss the chance to get real combat experience and asks if she thinks he'll just get in the way. With a smile, she admits he knows perfectly well he won't be in the way, since she can't even beat him in a sparring match anymore. But Surya warns that you never know what can happen in a real fight, especially in a monster nest that just suddenly appeared. She concludes that for such a dangerous job, it's better for him to wait until he has more actual combat experience. Gray realizes she's dead set on going alone and says that in that case, he has an idea. Surya asks him what kind of idea. He then declares he'll fight her to stop her, and after that, he'll deal with the ogres himself. The two of them face off for a moment. Gray points his sword at her. Surya then smiles and finally says she gives up, but she asks him to promise her one thing. No matter what, his master demands that he come back safe. Gray says he plans on doing just that. He also tells his master not to get defeated, and she agrees as they head into the forest together. The two approach a large ravine where the ogre nest is located. Surya comments that they're pretty confident building a nest in a place with no escape route. Gray points out that means they can't escape either, and it's better to be cautious with intelligent monsters. Surya agrees. She surveys the area ahead. Surya notes that she can't see the chief anywhere and assumes he's in his tent. She suggests they thin out the numbers before he appears. Then she tells Gray to take out the enemies he can see one by one from his side. His master informs him that she'll take the other side. Gray says he understands and she approves the plan. Surya gives the signal and they leap into the camp. An ogre spins around, sensing the movement. Then Surya charges at it with her sword drawn. She takes down the first enemy with a single precise strike. A nearby ogre notices the attack. It then alerts the other monsters in the camp. The horde of ogres rushes toward the invaders. Gray draws his sword and charges into the crowd of enemies. He defeats one of the approaching ogres. Gray continues to cut down the ogres charging at him. Surya also presses forward, carving a path through the monsters with her sword. Together, the two fight in sync, felling the enemies around them. Soon, they're standing alone amidst the defeated ogres. Surya praises his performance, but he warns her to stay alert, telling her the battle is just getting started. Then, Gray realizes something is strange about the situation. He notes the ogres were too weak, which means his master could have easily handled them alone. Unless the real threat was in the tent up ahead. From the darkness of the main tent, two eyes are watching. An intimidating presence reveals itself in the shadows. Gray feels an overwhelming power coming from that direction. He turns to Surya and shouts for them to get out of there and run, leaving her confused. He then pushes her and insists they just flee immediately. Surya agrees and the two begin to retreat from the camp. Gray leads the way, looking back with a tense expression. Suddenly, an elite ogre lands, blocking their escape route. Surya gets ready to fight. She identifies the monster as the elite ogre, believing it to be the nest's chief. But Gray yells that it's not the chief. An even larger creature emerges from the shadows. The new monster lets out a deafening roar. The other ogres just watch the scene. Surya asks what that creature is. She realizes it's something far stronger than an elite ogre. Gray reveals that it's an ogre general. The monster reveals itself as the true chief of the nest. It sits on a stone throne watching the two intruders. Surya says an ogre general isn't a monster they can defeat on their own, but she composes herself for the fight. Then, his master charges forward, shouting for them to fight their way out. Surya rushes in, her sword clashing against the ogre general's weapon. She then focuses for her next move. His master dodges the attack and counters with a side slash. She manages to land a solid hit on the monster, but Surya notices something unexpected. The wound on the ogre general begins to heal on its own. Gray understands it's useless, as the general's roar boosts the strength and recovery of its allies. Now, Surya realizes she can barely hold off a single empowered ogre. Even so, Gray manages to take down one of the monsters. He then turns to the general and tells his master he's leaving his back to her. He asks her to just buy him some time. Surya asks what he's planning to do. The young man simply says there's only one choice, and that choice is to take down the monster commanding all the others. Gray Lee blocks an ogre's strike with his sword. He finds it annoying when they try to flank him, so he strikes the creature with a spinning slash. One of the ogres charges forward, axe in hand. Gray needs to focus on defeating all the enemies before him. His blade shatters against the monster's body. He realizes his sword can't withstand a strengthened ogre. With a new sword in hand, he parries another attack. Luckily, he had a spare, but he knows it's only a matter of time before it breaks too. Jacob Bloomfield throws his own sword for Gray to use. Gray catches it in midair and thanks him. He now has two swords, but they won't be enough for everyone. Just for the general and the ogres in his path. He then sheathes the second blade and declares that they are enough. Wielding both swords, the young man charges the ogre general and his minions. Gray Lee cuts down an ogre in his path, but he's forced to block another's axe. The impact sends him staggering back for a moment. Then he leaps over the horde to strike from above. A mysterious figure watches from a distance. The ogre general roars at his troops. Gray is surprised to see the monsters transform. He realizes they've been strengthened even more. An ogre shoves him back during a block. The creature says it saw through his plan. The ogre general admits his intellect isn't just for show. Blades clash in combat. He continues to fight another monster. He pushes through the creatures, ordering them to get out of his way. Gray charges through the horde of ogres. He states that he has no time to waste on them as he cuts through the horde. Then an ogre manages to grab him from behind. Another monster approaches to strike him with an axe. The blow hits him squarely. He realizes they're trying to wear down his swords by throwing themselves at him. One of the creatures lunges forward with its fist raised. Gray manages to block the punch with his sword, but the blade shatters from the force of the impact. The force of the blow knocks the wind out of him. Fallen on the ground, he tries to recover. He's now down to his last sword, and he has to face hordes of ogres and the general with just one blade. He knows that because of his experience before he regressed, he can't win. But in that moment, a new determination rises. He gets up and wields his last sword against the army of monsters. Gray yells for his master to run while the monsters are focused on him. Surya just gives a faint smile in response. She turns to an ogre and says she can't do that. He asks if she plans to be defeated for nothing, but she promises to follow him later. Surya denies it with a look, and states that she can't run anymore. Gray watches the scene, hopeless. He sees himself with no options left, and regrets traveling back in time to defeat the liquidators. He swings at the approaching ogre, but he wonders if it's all going to end in a place like this. Surrounded, his sword breaks. He holds the broken hilt and states that it's not over yet, and he remembers the power from that time. As long as he can use that power, the fight will continue. He concentrates, certain he can defeat all these enemies. He just needs to remember that moment. He needs to remember the feeling from that time. Clutching the sword's hilt, he maintains his focus. Then, he closes his eyes for an instant. A single eye opens in the darkness. An unknown force completely envelops him, and it materializes into a new sword in his hand. Surya calls out his name. He turns his face to the side. With a smile, he assures her that everything is fine. Then he charges forward, cutting down all the ogres in his path. His new blade shatters the ogre general's axe. The monster looks down, surprised by the blow that struck it. Surya watches the scene, unable to understand. Surya now faces the remaining ogres alone. She comments that their attacks feel light, and admits they really gave her a hard time. The warrior defeats the creatures with ease. She then states that without the general to strengthen them, they are nothing. Amidst the fallen monsters, Gray says that they somehow made it. Then he apologizes for breaking her sword, but Surya says she doesn't mind since he saved her life. She places her hand on his, and begins to ask about the attack he used. Before she can finish her sentence, Gray collapses. Surya then screams his name. Gray wakes up in an unknown place and wonders where he is. He finds himself alone in a vast, dark void before a structure. A chain door appears before him. The chains binding the door are suddenly shattered. Then the door opens and he questions what it is. He recognizes that power as he sees an eye emerge from the darkness. Gray then wonders if he'll gain the power if he opens it. He hesitates for a moment. Then he takes a step back. A vision of a skeletal creature assails him. He decides not to approach the door. He doesn't know why, but he's certain of one thing. And if he opens that door as he is now, he would be defeated forever. A mysterious voice praises him for his wise decision. Gray's eyes snap open. He wakes up gasping in a bed. Surya approaches and says he's finally awake. He asks where he is, and she explains it's the village infirmary, where he's been unconscious for 5 days. Gray concludes that he slept for 5 days because he pushed his body too hard. But Surya doesn't think pushed too hard is the right description for what he did. She then asks if his body is okay and if he can move. He says he'll see, and realizes he can't gather any strength in his right arm, wondering if he'll be able to hold a sword. Also, he notices strange marks on his bandaged arm. Surya asks if his arm isn't moving well, and he says he can't put any strength into it. She explains that, as she thought, it won't heal anytime soon, as the bones in his arm were severely affected. He is surprised by the severity of the injury, but comments that he doesn't feel any pain. Surya tells him they treated the injury with a magic potion. Gray is shocked by the cost and asks if it isn't very expensive. Surya reassures him, telling him not to worry, as the village chief gave them the potion. Gray wonders why the chief would give something so expensive to someone like him. She questions what he's talking about. Then Surya states that he is this village's hero. He is left speechless by her declaration. The village chief rushes into the infirmary, calling for Gray. Gray tries to thank him for the magic potion, but the chief says they are the ones who should be thanking him. He explains it was an ogre general, a monster that not even the forces of neighboring cities could stop. The chief states that if he hadn't defeated it, the village would have been destroyed, and adds that if it weren't for him and Surya, the potion, the infirmary, and the villagers wouldn't be here. The two warriors listen to the man's words. Gray replies that he's exaggerating. But the chief insists he's not exaggerating and that Gray himself should know it. He looks away for a moment. A memory of a burning village confirms that maybe the chief is right. He remembers that in the world before his regression, this village was supposed to have been destroyed by the ogre attack. The chief says that if he still doesn't realize the importance of what he did, he can explain in detail, and asks if it's true that he'll be taking the exam for the World Union Academy. Gray just listens to the man's question. He realizes he went to face the ogre a week before the exams, and since he slept for 5 days, he now only has 2 days left. The journey to the academy takes 3 days on foot, but he could get there in a day on horseback if he had the money for it. So he apologizes to the chief and asks if he could lend him a horse. The chief replies that he figured he would say that, so he prepared the best horse in the village for him in advance. Surya adds that if he hadn't woken up today, they would have carried him there in his sleep. He then opens the door to leave. His eyes adjust to the light outside. As he steps out, he's met by a crowd of villagers waiting for him. They all thank him and wish him luck on his exams, telling him he has to pass. They continue to thank him for saving the village. One of the villagers approaches and asks Gray to accept a gift. He holds the small pouch and asks what it is. The man explains it's something the whole village contributed to, as they heard the registration for the World Union Academy is expensive. Gray looks at the villagers for a moment. Then, he smiles and thanks everyone. Next to the horse, he tells Surya it will be hard to come back if he fails, but she reassures him not to worry. She states that none of the candidates at the academy could defeat an ogre general. He worries about the condition of his right arm, but Surya asks if his left one still works fine. Gray clenches his fist and confirms it does, but hesitates. She says that's more than enough, and that he won't need to use that power either. He still fears the entrance exam won't be lenient enough for him to pass with only one arm. Surya assures him it'll be fine, as the academy's examiners aren't blind to his skill, and with confidence, she states that he will definitely pass. He thanks her very much and says that after hearing that, he can't fail now. As he rides away on horseback, he reflects that this village destroyed in the previous world still exists here. This world is no longer the same, as the future can be changed, and he will do it with this power. With one last look, he announces his departure. Arriving at his destination, he's thankful he made it in time. He observes the place before him. Then he spots the enormous structure on the horizon. The World Union Academy finally appears before him. Birds fly over the grand arena. An announcement states that exam tickets are about to be distributed, and everyone must remain in the central arena. A candidate remarks that everyone here is being tested, but only about 20 of them will pass. Others discuss how the number of successful candidates varies greatly each year, ranging from 50 to just 1. Then a woman steps forward to address all the candidates. She announces the start of the ticket distribution, asking everyone to take the paper that will appear in front of them. With a snap of her fingers, she begins the process. Then papers begin to materialize in front of each candidate. Gray Lee watches the exam paper appear in his hand. His ticket shows the number 513 for the swordsmanship course, and the woman confirms that everyone has received theirs. The official on the podium advises them not to be surprised that only the number and course are written, as it's the same every year. The woman on the platform gives a slight smile. She continues, stating that the World Union Academy does not discriminate based on age, gender, nationality, or status. The crowd listens intently. There are no other exceptions, and she concludes that not even their names matter. The woman points to the crowd and declares that their names are of no importance whatsoever. She explains that only those who pass the exam and earn the right to cross the bridge will be asked for their names, and even then, they can give a fake one if they prefer. Gray Lee questions the system, since his ticket placed him in the swordsmanship course, but he left his sword at the inn. Then the woman reveals that she assigned the courses based on each person's appearance, and she challenges anyone who was incorrectly assigned to raise their hand. A candidate asks if she's kidding, as it's impossible to have chosen everyone's course just by looking at them. Others in the crowd speculate that they must have been investigated beforehand, or that she used mind-reading magic. The official on the podium notes that no one seems to be in the wrong course and announces that the exam schedules will now be released. New information appears on Gray Lee's ticket, scheduling his exam for the first day at 11 in the morning. He regrets it being on the first day, as he had hoped for more time for his arm to heal. The woman informs them that the practical exam is a single phase and that being late will result in automatic disqualification. She finishes by saying they do not accommodate personal requests for schedule changes. Gray Lee holds his arm, wishing it would recover at least a little by the next day. The scene shifts to the next day in front of the arena. He realizes his arm hasn't improved and he'll have to take the exam like this. An official asks the next candidate to wait at the arena entrance. Gray Lee composes himself, deciding not to be pessimistic about the situation. He moves his hands, confirming his left arm is functional and his right can move a little. So he decides to use the remaining time to observe the examiner's movements and find an opening. From his position, he watches the fight in the arena as the examiner allows the opponent to make the first move. The candidate in the arena agrees and gets ready. With his sword raised, he charges forward to attack. The candidate's strike is intercepted by the examiner. The examiner stops the attack with his own sword. The candidate states that it's not over yet. He then applies more force to his attack. The examiner continues to block the blow. The candidate's face is reflected on the examiner's blade. The examiner begins to push the opponent's sword back. In a fluid motion, he deflects the candidate's weapon and prepares a counterattack. The examiner throws the candidate to the ground with a single blow. He then informs him that the exam is over, allowing the young man to take his weapon and leave. Gray Lee watches the scene unfold. The young man closes his eyes for a moment. Then, the examiner calls for the next candidate, number 513. Gray Lee confirms he is ready for combat. The examiner once again allows the candidate to make the first move, and Gray Lee agrees. He wields the sword, preparing for combat. A woman taught him that the sword doesn't move with just the arms, and he moves forward. She instructed him to channel the strength of his entire body through his arms. Even with his injured right arm, he prepares to direct the force from his other muscles into the blow. Gray Lee delivers a sideways strike against the examiner. The strike doesn't go as planned, as moving the sword without arm strength proves to be a great challenge. The examiner barely manages to react in time. Gray Lee wonders as he sees the instructor's sword up close. He realizes the examiner's sword movement is somewhat slow. The young man then advances and attacks the examiner. He notes that the examiner has great power, but his speed and technique don't compare to his master's. The young man realizes he can compensate for the lack of strength in his arm if he uses the swordsmanship he learned from her. With that in mind, he prepares for the next assault. Gray Lee then unleashes a series of rapid strikes. The examiner struggles to block the attacks. The young man realizes his opponent isn't as strong as he imagined. He remembers his master telling him he would definitely pass. The two swords clash with force. Gray Lee continues to pressure the examiner during the fight. He believes he can actually win this fight. The combat intensifies with a rapid exchange of blows. Gray realizes he has already figured out the examiner's fighting style, but the examiner's blade begins to give way. The examiner pushes him back with a powerful strike. He concludes the power gap is too wide and it's not easy to win with just one hand. He also notices his opponent's movements are becoming cruder, so the young man decides to risk a move. He challenges the examiner to come forward. The examiner charges with a wide swing. Gray smiles, seeing the huge opening left by the attack. He dodges the blow and positions himself for a counterattack. Nothing exposes an opening more than a wide swing, and the examiner's attack hits the ground. The young man gets behind his opponent. Gray realizes the power difference doesn't matter. He moves in to strike from behind his opponent. Then, a voice orders the fight to stop. Gray Lee's sword stops inches from the examiner's back. He wonders if the fight is over, thinking it was too soon to stop. An official announces that the time limit for the exam has been reached, and with that, the result will be a draw. The young man laments the result, realizing he didn't pass. He tightens his grip on the sword. Still, he accepts it, knowing he did his best. Walking down the stairs, he reflects that things will be tough if he can't even beat the examiner. He decides he'll have to take the exam again next year once his arm is healed. The young man then turns to the arena and gives his thanks. A week passes, showing the Grand Academy building. In meeting room 53 of the World Union Academy, a council is gathered. An older man asks for their thoughts on the candidates now that everyone has finished the exam. One of the board members complains of fatigue and suggests splitting the work next year, calling the current method inefficient. But another man argues that they can't overlook talent just to make their jobs easier. The meeting leader then asks them to focus on the students, not the system, starting with the swordsmanship course. He projects the results in the room and asks who the passing candidates are. An instructor explains that anyone who defeated the examiner passed, while the others will be judged on the quality they showed within the time limit. Besides the winners, candidates number 5, 217, and 793 stood out from the rest. One of the counselors suggests keeping only those, as the others wouldn't be able to keep up, and no one opposes the decision. The silence in the meeting room confirms the choice. Then the older man announces that the candidates for the swordsmanship course have been confirmed. A voice in the room asks about candidate number 513. The red-haired woman wants to know what they thought of candidate 513. The examiner who fought Gray Lee gives a smile. Another council member refers to the young candidate as that little guy. He comments that it looked like the boy was going to win, but things will be tough if he needs tricks to defeat an examiner. Another instructor concludes that his technique was good, but he lacks strength, and that he seemed at a disadvantage from start to finish. The council leader dismisses him, stating that in that case he won't do. The other board members watch the decision with a smile. The red-haired woman prepares to give her opinion. She remarks that so many watched and no one noticed, and that if everyone is so blind, perhaps it really is a waste to observe together. The next day, the city is bustling under the Great Clock Tower. Gray Lee's ticket still shows number 513 for the swordsmanship course. He hears the announcement that the successful applicants will be revealed and that only 6 candidates have passed. Then he braces himself to hear the result. A candidate's ticket bursts into flames as numbers 5 and 217 are announced. More tickets ignite as numbers 432, 515, 753, and 925 are called. The announcer states that these are all 6 candidates accepted for the swordsmanship course. The successful applicants are instructed to cross the bridge and complete their enrollment by the end of the day. Gray Lee holds his untarnished ticket while other candidates celebrate around him. He realizes that, after all, he failed. A new announcement begins for the Divine Eye Special Admission. Candidate number 513 is called, and his ticket manifests. The crowd reacts with surprise at the sight of his ticket. He looks down at it and wonders if he passed. 2 men in the crowd comment that the Divine Eye Special Admission happened again this year. Gray Lee looks confused as it's the first time he's heard of it. A woman suggests it's just a backdoor entry and that the academy is in decline. He reflects on the accusation of getting in through the back door. He has no connections and wonders if his master had something to do with it, though she never mentioned anything. An older man scolds the others for bad-mouthing the Divine Eye Special Admission. He explains that it is an honorable category that has been producing heroes for over 100 years. The 2 men scoff, saying that old folks love that admission and that it was only impressive back in the day. Someone in the crowd lists recent Divine Admission candidates, including Amy White, Bella Albright, and Jacob Bloomfield. The same person claims they are all complete failures, a fact known even to the current candidates. Images of Amy White and Bella Albright are displayed, and the image of Jacob Bloomfield is also shown. He realizes the 3 were part of the main force against the Liquidator, and now he wonders if his name will be listed alongside theirs. An announcement states that the entrance ceremony will begin in 30 minutes and that everyone should gather in the square in front of the main office. The students then change into their new uniforms bearing the academy's emblem. Gray Lee walks with the other freshmen toward the meeting place. A student asks if they've come to the right place since there's nothing in the square in front of the main office. Then, a man approaches the group of students and apologizes. He explains there was a small delay in the setup due to some confusion. He asks 2 students to move aside a bit so he can place the stairs in that spot. Then, he positions himself on the spot and confirms it's perfect. The 2 students watch the scene, not understanding what is happening. The man says everything is ready and places his hand on the ground. A large circle forms on the ground from his hand. Structures then begin to rise from the ground. The students react with shock at the sudden construction. A grand hall with staircases materializes before everyone. The man apologizes for the delay and invites everyone to sit wherever they like. The 2 students watch the scene, still not understanding what happened. One of them asks if that was teleportation magic, surprised that something so large could be moved. Gray Lee sits down, assuming the ceremony is being held here so they can see the school building in an extravagant way. He then gives a slight smile. Before them, the power of the World Union Academy is revealed. Gray questions if the number of seats isn't excessive for just 30 approved students. A nearby female student asks if he really doesn't know the reason. The young man apologizes, explaining he never studied anything besides how to wield a sword, so his classmate offers to tell him. She explains that the academy brings together the best students from all over the world, and she points to the sky, saying they are coming. The young man with the ponytail looks up. The sky fills with approaching airships and dragons. He is stunned by what he sees on the horizon. The enormous airship approaches, and he questions what it is. Gray Lee recognizes the magic airship as the Strato Queen, which he had been on when he was part of the Liquidator Subjugation Squad. He is surprised to see one of the world's largest airships being used for a simple entrance ceremony. One of the airships lands, demonstrating the power of the World Union Academy. The students from the airships descend toward the ceremony site. On the podium, the man observes that everyone has arrived. Then he smiles and announces the start of the entrance ceremony. After the principal's speech, everyone in the audience applauds. Gray Lee yawns, finding the ceremony not much different from a normal one. An announcement invites the top students from each course, calling Leonhardt from the swordsmanship course to come forward. As he walks up the stairs, students comment that he was the one who defeated the examiner instantly during the exam. Others say that when it comes to swordsmanship, he's as good as any of the teachers. His name is Leonhardt Apias. Gray Lee watches him intently. He turns to the teachers and asks if he can speak freely, receiving an affirmative answer. The young man thanks them and prepares to begin his speech. Leonhardt announces that he has a complaint to make to the academy. He addresses his fellow students, or rather, everyone who was admitted the proper way. With a hand on his chest, he states that it is an honor to be admitted to the academy with the rest of them, and he invites them to work hard together so they can graduate as individuals capable of making significant contributions to the world. He looks forward to the days when they can aim high together as students of the prestigious World Union Academy. But he laments that among them, there is someone who does not deserve to be there, and he directs the question to the Divine Eye, Professor Ariel. The professor replies that all the students there passed the rigorous exam and that while they may not be as strong as him, she doesn't think it's wise to exclude them. And she finishes by asking why he is asking her that question. Leonhardt clarifies that he isn't talking about those who were admitted by passing the exams properly. He continues, referring to the student she admitted through the back door. Then he mentions her Divine Eye special admission. He demands that the specially admitted student reveal themselves, return their uniform, and leave the academy immediately. The student audience begins to stir and look around. Gray Lee wonders about all this hostility directed at him. Gray Lee is relieved that Leonhardt doesn't know his face, hoping he won't be involved if he just stays quiet. Professor Ariel comments that this year's new students seem quite lively. Leonhardt states that he is serious and demands that she stop admitting students through the back door. Then she approaches and asks if he thinks he's stronger than that boy. The two face each other on stage in front of the entire academy. Leonhardt reacts with surprise to her question. He composes himself to answer the provocation. Then he states that of course he is and questions if she's implying he's wrong. The professor says she likes his attitude and proposes a bet. He questions her proposal and she simply confirms. Ariel declares that her position and the boy's admission will be at stake. Gray Lee wonders about the sudden bet. Leonhardt asks if she plans to make him fight the special student, but she denies it, saying she wouldn't do something so crude. She explains that if he went all out, Leonhardt would be severely injured, and as an educator, she can't risk her student's safety. He questions if she's provoking him. Ariel states she's serious and suggests the bet be about monsters to be safer. She adds that he's much better at fighting monsters than humans, and he acknowledges she's well informed. Then the young man asks what the bet is exactly. She replies it's simple. They just need to defeat the monsters she chooses as targets. With each round, the target monster will get stronger, and the first one who fails to defeat their monster loses. If the special student loses, she will retire from her teaching position, and all special admission students will be expelled. But if Leonhardt loses, he'll have to do whatever she commands. She then faces him and asks what he thinks of the proposal. He asks to know the target monsters first. Although he's confident he can handle any opponent, he'd rather not get caught in a strange trap. The professor reflects for a moment and prepares to announce the first target. The professor suggests an overgeneral as the first target, and she asks if that would be too easy for him. The other students in the audience react with surprise to the choice. Gray Lee wonders why she specifically chose that monster. Leonhardt slams his fist on the podium. He claims an overgeneral is not a monster someone can defeat alone. Ariel says she's not asking him to defeat one immediately and suggests a one-year deadline. He retorts that if someone could defeat a disaster-level monster with just a year of training, people wouldn't suffer, and asks for a more realistic target. Gray Lee watches the discussion intently. Then, he smiles as he understands the situation. Leonhardt accuses her of deliberately choosing a monster no one can defeat, so there's no clear winner, and refuses to agree. Then, Ariel adds one more condition, stating that if it's a draw, he wins. She explains that if the boy fails to defeat the Ogre General, she will be fired and all special students will be expelled. The professor confirms the proposal with a nod. Leonhardt questions her sanity, feeling the bet's outcome is already decided. The professor asks if he has any more objections. Leonhardt specifies that it can't be an Ogre General that has already been weakened. She agrees that of course it won't be. Then the professor materializes a quill and a contract. She informs him that the details are already written on the magic contract, and he can sign if he has no issues. The young man observes the contract floating in front of him. Then he accepts the bet and signs the document. Leonhardt questions if she truly believes that boy can win, but she just replies, "Who knows?" The professor turns and walks away from the podium. The other teachers comment, wondering if she isn't using the bet as an excuse to retire. One of them mentions she's past her prime, after all. Gray Lee observes the situation, realizing the bet is official. He then wonders if the monster he defeated before enrolling would be included in the one-year deadline. Professor Ariel looks in his direction. The young man realizes the bet was already won from the moment it began. The professor makes a silencing gesture to Gray Lee, who concludes that she plays dirty. A professor with a book in his hands announces the start of the class on the fundamentals of magic. He acknowledges that some might be surprised by a class on the first day, but as academy students, they can't waste a single day. The professor then starts with the basics, explaining how to use magic. He teaches that inside our bodies is an invisible energy called either, which can be manipulated through magic circuits. The class watches the professor's demonstration intently. Gray Lee feels relieved he can follow the lesson, as he heard the same explanations at the training camp. Then he realizes what his real problem is. The fact that he ended up in the same class as Leonhardt. He hopes no one finds out he's the special admission student of the Divine Eye. The professor calls out a student who looks bored. He scolds him for already looking away less than 5 minutes into the class. Gray apologizes, surprised to be noticed even though he's at the back of the room. The professor holds up the book and challenges him to show his knowledge to the class, since he seems so confident, and he asks if the young man is capable of using basic magic. Gray Lee argues that, with all due respect, he thought it would be fine if he didn't know how to use magic since they're in the swordsmanship course. But the professor explains that even if he can only use a sword, he needs to know the basics to coordinate with a mage in a real fight. He realizes that even the explanation is the same as the training camps and wonders if the spell they're going to learn will also be the same. The young man then asks if the spell they will learn is Aether Projectile. The professor confirms, asking if he knows how to use it, and Gray replies that he does. He feels relieved, realizing the hellish training camp wasn't in vain. The professor decides to use this opportunity for a match and asks Leonhardt if he can also use Aether Projectile. He replies that, of course, he can. Leonhardt adds that he was trained not only in swordsmanship but also in magic even before starting school, and questions if it's not risky to put him against the other student. The professor reassures him, saying he doesn't need to hold back, as regardless of the skill gap, they will only use Aether Projectile and no one will get seriously hurt. Then he reveals that young Gray is this year's Divine Eye student, leaving Leonhardt surprised by the information. Everyone in the classroom turns to look at Gray. He's shocked by this sudden revelation, and the professor simply smirks, as he just spilled the beans. Leonhardt decides he needs to show Gray how things work. He states he's going to show him what kind of place the academy is. Then, he orders the young man to come down for the showdown. Gray Lee reacts to the challenge. The professor instructs them both to fire their Aether projectiles at their opponents on his signal. Gray braces himself, aware he's only spent a few days learning magic and might not come out unscathed. As the combat begins, Leonhardt prepares his attack to show the difference in strength between them. Gray Lee also focuses his energy, feeling he has no other choice. He decides to go all out. Then the young man fires a large sphere of energy toward his opponent. Both students are stunned by the spell's result. The young man recovers and assures him he's fine, to the older man's relief. He silently watches the student compose himself. The professor surveys the destruction, realizing the barrier barely contained the impact, then turns to Gray Lee, questioning how he conjured such a powerful Aether projectile. Gray Lee stares at his own hand and wonders aloud what he just did. He recognizes the spell was weak and different from what he was used to. He then wonders if the subjugation squad's Aether projectile is different from the one taught at the academy. The young man asks if he used the wrong spell, but the professor confirms it was an Aether projectile. But he explains that the quality was different. It wasn't ordinary Aether. It was super compressed Aether. Gray Lee states he's never heard of that. The professor reveals it's a power that not even the instructors can easily replicate. The other students comment on the Divine Eye's admission, saying he should be in the magic course. But the young man knows that's not the real explanation. He remembers that all the subjugation squad's spells were like this, and that he had no aptitude for them. Gray Lee challenges the professor while casting a spell, claiming anyone could do it with practice. The professor just starts to smile at the comment. The young man watches his reaction, confused. Then the older man begins to laugh openly. The professor's reaction leaves him completely bewildered. He approaches and suggests the student transfer to the magic course, saying he has more talent for it than for swordsmanship. But Gray Lee refuses the offer, explaining he's already been told he's not good at magic. The professor counters, stating he's a prodigy for being able to use the Aether compression technique at his age. He insists that whoever evaluated him knew nothing and again asks him to transfer to the magic course. The other students watch the scene, surprised to see such a strict professor praise someone so highly. The older man points at the young man, saying it would be a crime against magic if he didn't follow this path. The young man responds with a suppressed smile, but the term Aether compression technique reminds him of something from his past. A female professor explains on a chalkboard that in the old days, people didn't know about life force, and because of that, it was very difficult for them to cast magic properly. In his memory, a woman explained that they needed to compress the Aether and only use the parts that mixed with Ode. She then comments that looking back, it was all rather funny. Back in the present, Gray Lee asks the professor if he knows about Ode. The older man looks confused and asks what that is. From his reaction, the young man confirms that the world doesn't yet know about the existence of Ode. Then he questions what he learned in the subjugation squad. The young man realizes all his knowledge came from the future. The professor interrupts, insisting he transfer to the magic course, while Gray Lee decides he needs to be careful about who he shares his secret with. But the young man refuses, explaining that he loves swords, though he appreciates the offer. The older man laments, saying there's nothing to be done if that's how he feels, but he instructs him to seek him out anytime if he changes his mind. Gray Lee thanks him again for the offer. The professor sends him back to his seat, telling him he can leave the class if he gets bored. He states that the lecture is too basic for the student's level. The other students watch, impressed by the high regard Professor Carlos holds for him. Gray Lee starts walking back to his seat in the amphitheater. Leonhardt turns to him and calls him Lord Grey. A sudden chill runs down the young man's spine. Later, he reads a note from Professor Ariel summoning him to her office. Walking down the hall, he wonders aloud about the reason for the sudden summons. The young man then assumes Professor Carlos might be behind it. He finally arrives at a large ornate door. A voice from inside asks if he is Grey and says the door is open. He starts to enter the room, announcing his presence. Suddenly, a blade lunges toward him. The young man reacts by drawing his sword. With a swift movement, he manages to block the surprise attack. The figure inside the room watches him. Grey Lee then realizes his body reacted on its own. With his sword in hand, Grey Lee questions the girl on the floor about the reason for her attack. Grey Lee holds his ground, staring at the girl on the floor. He watches her for a moment. Then the young woman gets up, and he stares at her. He gets the feeling he's seen her somewhere before. Across the room, Professor Ariel comments that he wasn't bad at all. She then states that her eyes didn't deceive her. One of the men asks if Bella went easy on him. Her movements were perfect, but getting disarmed was strange. Hearing the name, Grey Lee confirms that she is Bella Albright. He recognizes her as the sorceress. Professor Ariel turns to the other two and asks if they should just quit their teaching jobs. One of them quickly says it was just a joke. Then he admits he has no choice, tossing some coins. Grey Lee asks what the professors are doing. The woman reveals they were betting on whether he could defend himself from the surprise attack, and thanks to him, she won a good sum of money. She then tosses him a part of the winnings. Grey Lee looks at the gold coin in his hand, wondering if it isn't worth a fortune. One of the professors comments that even so, the situation was exactly as the other had said. The scene repeats, focusing on the professor's conversation. He observes that during the fight, it seemed the boy didn't use his dominant arm on purpose. It was as if he was trying to protect his immobile arm. The other man asks if it was because of an injury. The professor supposes it's not an apparent physical injury, but rather a deeper kind of wound. The other agrees, saying a simple injury wouldn't cause that. Grey Lee asks how they can notice all that just by looking. One of them explains they would be professors if they couldn't notice such details, but that Professor Ariel already knew since the exam. Ariel then asks them to leave, stating she won't give up on her student. The two men admit the boy has potential, at least for now. But one of them warns him that if that wound doesn't heal, he won't meet the Academy's admission standards. He then asks the young man to keep that in mind. Professor Ariel watches the two leave before turning to Grey Lee. Grey Lee watches in silence, waiting for the professor to speak. Professor Ariel says that now that the others are gone, they can talk about magic. On the table, a tea set is already laid out. She reveals she heard about his use of super compressed ether in class, and the boy confirms that she's already aware. Ariel says that Professor Carlos came to her office to request his transfer to the magic course, but she refused. As she stirs her cup, she looks at him. To her, the young man is better suited to wield a sword than to use magic. The professor states that he doesn't seem good at magic compression, nor does he show any sign of having practiced the technique. The boy brings the cup to his lips, deciding it's better not to lie. He then agrees, saying it's exactly as she said. Ariel asks him to reveal the trick he used, promising secrecy and even a reward. She places a hand on Bella's shoulder and insists she must know for the girl's sake. Grey Lee asks if it's for Bella, almost calling her by her title of sorceress. The professor confirms, explaining that Bella is a genius in magic theory but terrible at its application. She concludes by saying that, for some reason, the young woman can't use the compression technique to create super compressed ether. Grey Lee comments that he'd heard Bella Albright was a late bloomer and now he understands why. But Professor Ariel points out that according to Carlos, he didn't seem to be compressing the ether when he used the technique. Ariel adds that if he helps, Bella won't have to be sent to Professor Bradley. The boy repeats the name Professor Bradley under his breath. He then asks if she means Professor Varian Bradley. The professor confirms and realizes he already knows of him. Grey Lee explains that it's impossible not to know him, as he's infamous for his countless human experiments. He remembers that the professor's actions were responsible for the loss of many lives and caused magical disasters. These disasters resulted in events that affected tens of thousands of people. The boy defines him as the worst magical criminal in history. Then he realizes that in this era, Bradley hasn't been captured yet. Ariel reveals that if Bella can't create super compressed ether by the end of the year, she'll be sent to him for surgery. Grey Lee asks her if that isn't a terrible idea. The professor confirms, explaining that the surgery is actually a pretext for human experimentation. She adds that, although it's not public knowledge, there are rumors that many of the participants suffered severe consequences or were left incapacitated. Bella Albright admits that despite the danger, she'll be expelled at the end of the year if she can't use super compressed ether. Professor Ariel replies that she'd rather have her drop out of the academy than let that man perform the procedure on her. Grey Lee reflects that his knowledge of magic doesn't belong to this era, and revealing it could alter history. The young woman clenches her fists in her lap. He continues to watch them in silence. A brief memory of a sinister figure and his own suffering flashes through his mind. Another memory of a chaotic battle hits him. Then he decides that the future he knows deserves to be changed. The boy places his hand on his cup and states that he understands the situation. He offers to teach her. Graylee promises to show her how to use super compressed ether as he summons a sphere of energy. Sometime later, they are gathered in a large arena. He uses a chalkboard to explain the fundamentals. When he's finished, he says he shared all his knowledge and asks them not to tell anyone. Professor Ariel assures him the secret is safe, as the magical contract they signed would bring severe consequences if they broke it. Gray turns to them and asks what they thought of his explanation. Professor Ariel admits that the knowledge he revealed goes far beyond what she had imagined. Then Bella adds that the explanation was so well organized it felt like a lecture from hundreds of years in the future. She states that just hearing his theory has advanced the history of magic by a century. The boy reflects that this was her lecture from 10 years in the future, so to someone from today, it would sound like a 100-year advancement. Professor Ariel admits she couldn't process all the information and asks Bella if she believes it. The young woman replies that there's a good chance the theory is correct, as nothing contradicts current magical knowledge. She then concludes that the fastest way to find out the truth is to test it. Bella holds up a sheet of paper and tells Gray that if everything he said is true, the spell should work. She concentrates and states that, according to his theory, this is her full power. With her staff in hand, the young woman casts a spell. Gray questions her, remembering that her full power was capable of devastating an entire city. As an enormous amount of energy is released, he recalls how she couldn't control her power. Bella herself watches the result, not understanding. The boy yells as the energy dissipates. Gray shields himself from the immense wave of power unleashed by Bella. He realizes the power would have been fatal if she hadn't controlled the magic at the last second. The flames swerve away from him at the exact right moment, saving his life. Bella celebrates having successfully controlled the spell. The fire then begins to stir and take on a new form. Before her, the flames morph into a gigantic dragon. She watches the creature, exclaiming that this is so much fun, but her control over the magic begins to waver. She says her ether has run out and collapses to the ground. Gray rushes to catch her as Professor Ariel approaches. The professor explains that she's only fallen asleep from exhausting her energy. The young man watches her, asleep in his arms. Ariel comments that it was wonderful to see Bella cast a spell of that scale in such a short time. In her sleep, Bella murmurs that the theory is amazing and that she can now easily create super compressed ether. The professor smiles and states that since Bella no longer needs the procedure, she will inform Bradley to cancel it herself. Professor Ariel adds that she's happy they avoided the procedure, and especially that Bella didn't lose her magical control. Gray asks her about magical control, and she confirms it. She then explains that Bradley's procedure, while increasing power, harms one's control by forcibly removing a person's limiter. He then wonders if it was because of that procedure that the sorceress from his past couldn't control her magic. Ariel holds up the contract and states that thanks to him, Bella has fulfilled her part of the deal. She then declares that it's her turn to fulfill her promise. The professor approaches and says she will use a spell on his arm. From her hand, several butterflies materialize and fly around the young man. The creatures gather over his arm. The energy released by the butterflies completely envelops him. As soon as the spell ends, she asks how he feels, and the young man tries to move his hand. He looks at her and confirms that he can move it. With a smile, the young man thanks the professor. Gray says that not even healing potions worked, but Ariel corrects him, explaining that her magic restores nerves. She then challenges him to wield a sword to see if his arm is back to normal, and he accepts. Gray prepares to test his newly healed arm. He then materializes a blade for the test. The young man observes the sword in his hand. With a series of swift movements, he tests the arm's agility. But he stops, noticing something is wrong. The young man comments that his arm doesn't move like it used to. Professor Ariel explains that while she repaired the nerves, her magic cannot heal the wounds of his soul. She confirms what she said, much to the young man's surprise. Ariel says that current magical knowledge hasn't yet proven the soul's existence, but she believes it exists. She then covers one of her eyes. With her special eye, she claims she can see it. The professor reveals that his soul is slowly recovering and will be fine if he doesn't overexert himself. The young man looks at his own hand, repeating her words. He asks if he should stop training, but she says it's not necessary if he just exercises normally. Then she questions what kind of swordsmanship could affect someone's soul in that way. The professor mentions an example of swordsmanship that uses the soul to move the sword. She then brings up the name Amy White and asks if he knows her. The young man is startled, wondering why she would mention the sword saint's name, since they shouldn't even know each other yet. Ariel asks if she's mistaken, as the way he wields a sword reminds her of Amy's style, but she notices a slight difference and guesses that his master is even more skilled. The professor adds that in a few years, Amy will reach the same skill level, leaving him stunned by what she knows. He tries to change the subject, saying he learned it in his hometown, and asks if swordsmanship can really affect the soul. The woman replies that ordinary swordsmanship certainly couldn't. She continues, explaining that an ordinary attack could never defeat an ogre general and everything around it in a single blow. The young man finally realizes she already knew about the incident. Ariel confirms it and reveals that, thanks to him, she's practically won the bet. The professor says she saw the aftermath of the scene and that not even the most advanced magic could have done that. She then points at him and asks if he used that mysterious power. Gray asks if she can see it with her eye, and the woman confirms that she can. The professor states she can see the power leaking through a chained door. The chained door is the image the professor uses to describe the power she sees within him. Gray realizes this isn't a guess and that she can truly see his hidden power. The professor then reveals she has seen a power similar to his before, though it had a different feel to it. The young man asks her if there are other people with a power like his. She confirms there are, but she isn't sure if they're human or not. Then she reveals they are called the Annihilator. The professor notices that he's heard of them before. The young man doesn't understand why that name is being mentioned in this era. Next to a sleeping Bella, Ariel comments that she's heard of it, but didn't think the name was that well known. But she supposes it's no surprise since he knows such an advanced magical theory. Gray confirms to himself that his knowledge is from the future, though no one suspects it. Then the professor questions him about how much he knows about the Liquidator. He simply replies that it's an extremely dangerous threat to humanity. The young man states that it must be stopped before it appears or neutralized at all costs. Ariel agrees that it's dangerous, but comments that Balian Bradley seems determined to continue his experiments. Gray asks what Balian has to do with it. The professor stares at him. How else do you think he's involved? Then she reveals that the Liquidator is the being he's trying to summon. The young man is shocked by the revelation, as no one ever said the Liquidator was a human creation. He then remembers that in the previous timeline, the Academy acted strangely. They seem to know exactly where the Liquidator would appear. With a sudden realization, he looks at the professor. Gray wonders if the Academy was involved in the summoning all along. Gray insists that the experiment must be stopped immediately, and Professor Ariel agrees, but she explains that she lacks the authority to stop another professor and that her superiors wouldn't listen. The young man then asks who exactly these superiors are. Ariel replies that she can't say, and that only an order from the top can stop the experiment. He reflects that the Academy's leadership is more complicated than he imagined. Then the young man wonders if the fact that Bradley is a criminal doesn't change things. He remembers the illegal experiments from the future and knows exactly where they were conducted. Gray states that he knows the location of the experiments and that they can catch him in the act. But the professor dismisses the idea, explaining that breaking into a professor's lab is already a serious crime. She warns him that without concrete proof, they would be the ones arrested, and asks if he has any evidence right now. The young man remains silent, and she says they should drop the subject for now. He clenches his fist and says he understands her situation. Ariel changes the subject to his power and asks if he wants to learn how to control it. Surprised, he asks if she can do that, and she mentions a professor who specializes in unknown forces. The professor then reveals his name, Heathcote Longfellow. Gray is surprised to hear the name Heathcote Longfellow, the man who trained the Sword Saint herself. Professor Ariel says she figured that would interest him and offers to arrange a private training session for the next day. He accepts immediately, stating that the reason he joined the academy was to master his power. The young man can hardly believe he's found a lead so quickly. The next day, he begins his training with Professor Heathcote. Gray reflects on receiving private lessons from the famous master, but he wonders why they are just running through the forest. They cover a long distance through a wooded area of the academy. The professor scolds him for getting distracted and orders him to run to his absolute limit. Heathcote explains that only when his physical strength is exhausted will his soul's power awaken, and they won't touch his sword until then. As he runs, the young man thinks the training must have a purpose, but he worries about Balian's experiments. He then wonders if he's doing the right thing. A week later, Gray reports to Professor Ariel, who asks how his training is going. He replies that they basically just run, with a little sword practice at the end, but admits he feels stronger. Ariel smiles and comments that it sounds just like Heathcote. A man enters the room and excuses himself. He hands a sealed letter to Professor Ariel, who thanks him. Gray watches as she opens it and reads the contents. The professor reads the letter in silence. The young man asks what's wrong, and she hands him the paper. He begins to read the message. Bailey and Bradley's letter states that although Bella obtained a similar power, she didn't actually compress it. Therefore, her new ability is not recognized as super compressed ether, and the operation will proceed as planned. Gray crumples the letter and declares that this is insane. The professor comments that Bradley seems determined to force the surgery, even though it's no longer necessary. The young man asks if Bella can't just refuse, but Ariel explains that the contract is strict. Unless Bradley himself voids it, Bella's only options are expulsion or the operation. But Gray refuses to accept the situation. The professor slams her hand on the table and asks for his help. He then asks her to reveal the location of Bradley's lab so they can expose him and void the contract. With a smile, Gray asks if she hadn't said it would be dangerous to act without proof. Professor Ariel replies that they will find the proof and that she's putting her faith in him. But she corrects herself, saying that maybe she had it from the start because her eye told her the truth. She then reveals that her eye showed her he was telling the truth all along. Ariel admits it just took her a while to accept the truth, and he stares at her. The professor then turns to him and asks him to lead the way. She declares that together, they will bring Bradley's crimes to light. Gray reveals the lab is in the mountains near the village of Torul. The professor recalls that he has an academy-authorized lab in that location. The young man questions why he would conduct illegal experiments in an authorized lab. Ariel explains it's the perfect spot as no one would suspect it, and he could stay there for a long time. Besides, no academy professor would interfere with another's lab. Gray concludes that if they can get the evidence, breaking into the lab won't be a problem. Someone knocks on the door. Hearing Bella's voice, the professor tells her to come in. The young woman enters holding a letter and tells the professor she received it. Ariel takes the envelope to check its contents. The professor opens the letter and tells the girl not to worry, as she will take care of everything. Bella and Gray watch the professor confused. The young woman then asks if the professor intends to fight Very and Bradley alone because of her. Ariel simply responds with a faint smile. She then states that she alone is enough to handle the situation. Bella and Gray watch her, surprised by her declaration. Gray asks the professor to wait and says he'll go with her. Bella also volunteers, stating that the problem is hers after all. The professor cuts them off, reminding them that Bradley is a teacher and a dangerous individual. She says she can't let them go to such a dangerous place. But the young man argues that's exactly why she shouldn't go alone, and that he can help with his power. He also adds that, as her student, he'd be expelled if she disappeared. Gray asks her to let them decide their own fates. The professor stares at them through the reflection of her monocle. She then says they would go anyway, even if she forbade it. Ariel agrees to take them, but with one condition. The professor demands that no matter what happens, they prioritize their own safety. They agree to the condition she set. The group then travels to the mountains under the moonlight. Hidden in the forest, they watch the lab, and Gray questions if the illegal experiments really happened there. Ariel confirms and says they are there to find proof. Gray Lee confirms that this is definitely the place. Bella says she trusts him, but asks if they'll be able to get the proof without any trouble. Professor Ariel explains that Varian is at a conference, and they'll have to enter through the side wall to avoid any traps. The young woman questions if that's really a good idea, but Ariel reassures her, saying they're already trespassing anyway, and she can turn back if she wants. Bella grips her staff and confirms she's going. She then asks the professor if she's sure about doing all this for someone like her. He cuts her off, saying she's wrong. Then Gray explains that stopping the experiments is for the good of the world, as the entire world will be in danger. The girl asks him what he means by that. The professor agrees he needs to be stopped and tells Bella not to worry. Ariel states they aren't risking their lives for her sake. Then she gives the order to advance, and the three of them leap towards the lab. The professor conjures an attack spell, and with a single blow, she destroys the lab's sidewall. A massive explosion blasts a hole in the laboratory wall. Gray Lee watches the destruction and comments that it was overkill. The group then enters the site through the newly created opening, but he is surprised by what he sees inside the lab. In one of the cells, they see chains attached to the wall. Through the bars, they see the horrific consequences of the experiments. The young man remarks that there's no need to look for evidence anymore. Bella observes the terrible scene, shaken by what she sees. Professor Ariel states she can see 14 forbidden spells in addition to the illegal experiments. They continue to explore the place cautiously. In a wider room, he spots what looks like a summoning altar. The young woman asks what they should do now and if they should rescue the survivors. But Gray warns her they shouldn't take too long, as Varian could return at any moment. Suddenly, he senses a presence. A mysterious voice asks if they were calling for him. Professor Ariel wonders about his conference. Varian Bradley appears before them. The group is startled by the professor's sudden appearance. He reveals he sent a body double to the conference, as he had an important experiment to conduct. Ariel questions him about the experiment, and Varian confirms he has new materials. He says he'd like to use them immediately, but then he stares at them. Professor Varian declares a change of plans. The three of them brace for what's to come. He watches them through the reflection in his glasses, commenting that he needed materials with more magical potential. Varian admits he doesn't know how they discovered his experiments, but assumes they haven't told anyone. He then says that if they were to suddenly disappear, no one would ever suspect him. The student questions his plans, but Varian Bradley just says their contribution will expand the limits of magic. With a smile, he states that since he can't let them go, he'll ensure their presence is put to good use. Suddenly, a large explosion rushes towards Varian. The attack hits the hallway with great force. Bella Albright is the one who fires the spell with her staff as Professor Ariel watches the scene. After the dust settles, Varian deems the display of power magnificent. He turns to the group, repeating that it was truly magnificent. Varian's energy manifests around him. He comments that the Divine Eye Ariel is still in top form and that the special admission student has exceptional talent. Varian then decides he should perhaps take a closer look at the Divine Eye's other recruits. He confronts them from a distance, questioning a student's attempt to attack a professor. Bella replies that it's better to confront him than be defeated, even if she's lost her chance. Professor Ariel announces their retreat, stating they already have proof and the academy can handle the rest. But Varian asks if they really thought he would let them leave, unleashing his power. A wave of energy surges directly toward Bella. Professor Ariel steps forward to intercept the attack with a barrier. Behind her, Professor Carlos just screams her name, but Varian Bradley claims it's useless. as this is one of the fruits of his research, the flame of gluttony. He explains that it's a fire that devours defensive magic, turning the opponent's defense into its own fuel. Professor Ariel watches as he remarks that its only drawback is the cost of a rare material to conjure it. The professor's barrier begins to shatter. Then, her monocle breaks. She is thrown backward by the impact. Another defensive magic appears to stop the advancing flames. Bella Albright takes a stand to protect the group. Ariel then instructs her to take the spell Memory Bag to Gray, and says that if Heathcote Longfellow sees it, he'll know what to do. Bella stomps her foot hard on the ground. A large spherical barrier expands, protecting everyone from Varian's attack. Professor Ariel questions what Bella Albright is doing and urges her to flee, but Bella says the professor's barrier is breaking and that she will handle the situation herself. Ariel reminds her of the promise they made that she should put her life first, as Varian's magic can't be stopped with defensive spells. The professor's barrier shatters. Then Bella simply says it's alright. Her magic clashes directly with Varian's attack. She explains that his spell isn't that strong. It just requires a different kind of defensive magic. Varian Bradley is surprised as the theory to nullify his magic was known only to his group, and he demands to know how she knows it. Bella replies that someone recently taught her a new theory, and with it, the spell becomes easy. He then questions her about who taught her. Varian shouts, demanding the traitor's name in exchange for a quick defeat. The young woman asks if he really wants to know who it was, and with a smile, she just says it's a secret. Bella remembers Gray Lee explaining that even though he's a student in the swordsmanship course, the formula to nullify Varian's spell was correct. Varian concludes that she won't answer seriously. Varian Bradley resigns himself and holds a large crystal. Then, he commands the flames to advance. He crushes the crystal in his hand. A torrent of energy with floating spectral forms surges forward. The attack moves swiftly down the corridor. The energy condenses into a dark vortex. Varian launches the magic toward the group. Graylee asks if Bella Albright is okay, and she says yes, as the barrier can hold. But she hesitates for a moment. Varian Bradley taunts her, stating that her mana reserves won't last more than a minute. Bella then asks Professor Ariel to attack him since her hands are busy with the defense, and she agrees. The professor analyzes the attack before her. She notices the flames are thinner at one point and that she can project mana outside the barrier. Her hand passes through the barrier, generating electricity. Now outside, Ariel prepares to cast her spell. Professor Ariel fires an electric blast toward Varian. The spell shoots down the corridor at high speed, but the attack simply dissipates before reaching its target. Varian Bradley remarks that the counterattack attempt won't even reach him. Gray Lee remembers that the professor's offensive magic is one of the weakest among the staff, and with the flame's properties, it must be absorbing the cast spells. The group is at a loss. Then, Bella Albright warns that she's almost out of mana to maintain the barrier. Ariel turns to the students and says this is why she told them to run. She looks at Gray with concern. He then steps forward and tells the professor to leave the rest to him. Bella questions his plan, stating that his sword can't reach the enemy from that distance, but Gray just replies that it's fine and that he's sure he'll reach him. The professor warns him as using that power again could cost him everything and his arm might never recover. He then reflects on the possibility of being defeated alone. Gray Lee then states that it's better than the three of them being defeated together. Suddenly, a point of light appears in the center of Varian Bradley's magic. Gray's image appears reflected in a drop of liquid. He attacks from above, slicing through Varian's spell. Gray advances with his blade in a precise strike. Varian Bradley watches the hallway, now cleared of his magic, as Gray Lee and the others stand in the distance. Bella Albright just stares at him, completely shocked by what happened. Then Varian's body collapses to the floor, defeated. Professor Ariel remarks that this is the first time she's seen his true power with her own eyes. But the impact of the strike makes the hallway ceiling start to crumble above them. Large chunks of debris fall toward the group. A figure lands softly on the ground. The debris freezes in midair, suspended by thin lines of energy. Ariel comments that this was beyond her expectations. Putting that aside, she turns to Gray and asks if he's alright. He replies that his dominant arm aches and feels numb, but as he grips his sword, Gray confirms he can still move it. The professor concludes that his training is paying off, and the young man agrees. Gray reflects that before he would have been unconscious for days, but now it's just a sore arm. Gray recalls his training with Heathcote Longfellow, who pushed him to use every last ounce of his strength. Professor Ariel remains silent, watching the young man. She steps closer, thankful they're alive, but she regrets he had to use that power. Gray tells her not to worry. He was the one who insisted on stopping Varian, and he thanks her. She then asks him to please try not to use that power for a while. The professor warns him that if he does, the damage will be irreversible. Gray stares at her in surprise. He is silent for a moment. Then the young man simply says he's sorry. Bella asks him if that was magic, since she didn't sense any other. She says it's impossible to explain that much power with magic alone. Ariel apologizes and asks Bella not to investigate further or speak of what she saw. Bella asks why, as Ariel conjures a spell in her hand. Ariel warns her, saying she'll be forced to erase her memories if she doesn't promise to stay quiet. Bella quickly agrees and asks if they should seal it with a magical contract. Ariel agrees, telling her to proceed with the contract. They seal the magical pact with a signature. Ariel asks what's next. Gray suggests they first help the people on the floor. He notes that they just seem to be in a magical sleep. Ariel says that while they are in danger, they should be taken to the Academy's medical wing just in case. She then casts a spell that surrounds all the prisoners. The magic will protect them from any external harm for the time being. With that settled, Ariel decides to investigate the area more closely, remarking that the place is insane. The professor reveals her eye can see the illegal experiments which use forbidden procedures to create magical catalysts in people. These were also used to enhance a person's magical abilities. She doesn't see any experiments related to the liquidator, guessing they might be in another facility. Gray Lee finds this strange. This was the place where the incident that affected thousands in his past life happened. He then remembers that a miasma rising from the ground was what affected everyone. Ariel notices the change in Gray and asks what's wrong. Bella also calls his name, starting to grasp the true gravity of the situation. Gray Lee wonders if there could be something beneath this place. He suggests it might be underground with secret passages. Professor Ariel considers the possibility for a moment. After scanning the floor, she says she can't see any hidden passages. Ariel focuses her sight once more to be certain. Suddenly, she tells everyone to wait and walks over to Varian Bradley's body. The professor kneels to inspect the spot where he fell. She says that although faint, she can sense traces of short-range teleportation magic. Ariel concludes the destination is about 300 meters away, and there must be something there. Gray asks if they can reach 300 meters underground. Ariel confirms she can use a teleportation gate. She then says they should give it a try and snaps her fingers. A large magic circle forms on the ground surrounding the entire group. The professor notes that if there's nothing at their destination, the gate will just drop them in solid earth. The circle activates with a massive surge of energy. Everyone looks down, stunned by what they see through the portal. The portal reveals a massive city built entirely underground. Professor Ariel is shocked that such a large space exists beneath this place. Bella then feels a tremendous surge of either coming from all around, especially from one specific point. She points toward a large, circular building in the city's center. Ariel realizes it's not just either. It's a different kind of power, far greater than anything she's ever seen. Gray Lee then asks if this different power could be what he suspects it is. The professor simply confirms his suspicion. Then she reveals that it is the power of the liquidator, emanating from the central building. The group approaches the large, circular building in the center of the city. Upon entering, they find a large, sealed door at the end of the hall. Ariel confirms that the power is definitely coming from that place, but she notices there's no sign of the liquidator and touches the door. Bella asks if she's sure they should be messing with it, but the professor just tells her to relax. She opens the door slightly, stating that it holds no power. Bella Albright then says the door was placed there just as a symbol for the ritual. Ariel agrees, explaining that the power isn't in the door. She reveals that the source is in the magical equipment all around them. Inside one of the devices, a form of energy manifests. Suddenly, the entire system activates, and the group watches from a distance. Gray asks what's happening and if they're trying to summon the liquidator. Bella states that the magic is too dangerous and that they need to shut it down now. But Ariel stops her as her foresight tells her this facility can't actually summon the liquidator. The large door ahead then begins to shatter. Gray Lee yells that space is being torn apart, and Bella calls out for the professor. The energy from the equipment intensifies as the door continues to shatter. Gray and Bella watch the scene, not understanding what's happening. Professor Ariel then states that she already knew the energy in one of the devices stabilizes. She explains that the devices don't summon the liquidator, but merely open a small rift to where it exists. The substance gathers on the ceiling, channeling the power leaking through the rift. Ariel reveals that the core used to crystallize this power is life energy, estimating that the equivalent power of 10 individuals has been used so far. She surmises that most of the people they saw upstairs were captured for this purpose. Bella then questions her about why they would go so far to gather power, and the professor asks if she didn't see it. The professor refers to the black flame that Varian used in the fight, and she explains that the crystal that enhances it is basically what the catalyst will look like when it's ready. But she warns that the catalyst won't be limited to flames, and if they mass produce it, there's no telling what they plan to do. Ariel then notices that the cracks in the door are disappearing. Gray wonders if Varian wasn't trying to summon the liquidator, and the professor replies she doesn't know if he didn't try or just couldn't. She concludes that the space opening equipment was pushed to its limit, and that perhaps this was all they could do. Bella Albright comments that the apparatus is incredibly valuable, as she's never seen such precise, high-powered spatial warping magic. Professor Ariel agrees, adding that building one of them would cost a nation's budget, and that only one organization could have 8. Bella suggests it might be the Discar Empire, but Ariel denies the possibility. She explains that while it's the largest country in the world, they likely don't have the magical research resources to build one of these. Bella then asks who it could be. Then she deduces that it must be an organization whose magical research surpasses even that of the Empire. Gray Lee then chimes in, suggesting it's the World Union Academy. The suggestion leaves Bella completely stunned. Ariel confirms Gray's suspicion, stating that no other research body could afford this scale and budget. The group stands in silence at the revelation. The young woman questions if the Academy is behind this, since its function is to defend the world from threats. The professor understands why she doesn't want to believe it, but reinforces that there is no other group capable of such a feat. Gray argues that this doesn't mean the entire academy is the enemy, as the majority might still be on their side. He remembers that before the reset, the Academy's main forces were on the front lines, and he states that after seeing that future, he can't believe the Academy is an enemy of humanity. Professor Ariel agrees, saying it's exactly as he said. She believes that most of the Academy probably acts for the good of humanity and wouldn't allow experiments with such consequences. But the Academy has countless researchers, and with so many facilities, it's unlikely anyone in this world truly knows the full picture. The image of the Grand Hall reinforces the idea of the Academy's vastness. Ariel adds that whoever was behind Varian had very strong support, as he couldn't have organized all this alone. Bella Albright then asks if they can't fully trust the Academy, and the professor says she's been watching it from the inside for decades. She then confirms that it is definitely not an organization that can be blindly trusted. The professor believes that most of the people inside, including those responsible for the experiment, must think they are doing what's best for humanity, and that they've likely convinced themselves it was all for the greater good. The truth lies buried in darkness. Gray Lee asks if there's any idea how to find the mastermind, but Ariel reveals there are no communication devices in the facility. She explains that not even the creator's magical residue was left on the equipment, making the search for clues very difficult. Ariel then hesitates for a moment before continuing. Suddenly, one of the devices explodes behind Bella. Gray Lee is startled by the explosions that begin to erupt around him. The entire hall explodes in a chain reaction. Professor Ariel deduces they installed mechanisms to erase the evidence and wonders why they didn't detonate the place when Varian was stopped. Bella Albright cuts her off, saying it's not the time for hypotheses and that they need to get out of there. But the professor calms her down, explaining that they are just magical explosives. She then touches the ground, stating that the professors of the World Union Academy aren't weak enough. With a smile, Ariel declares that they won't be stopped by something like this. A large magic circle forms on the ground, protecting the group as the hall collapses. Professor Ariel warns them not to leave the magic circle while she channels the energy. The explosions destroy the entire area, but the barrier keeps them safe at the center. The hall is completely destroyed, leaving only the platform where they stand. Under the moonlight, the group is teleported to the outskirts of a large building. The spell brings with them all the people who had been captured. Ariel notes that everyone who was captured managed to escape safely. Gray Lee comments that he thought it was the end and that the situation was too dangerous. The professor explains that the teleportation was slow because of the extra baggage, but it was worth it since they recovered the equipment. With the devices in hand, she states that the Academy can no longer ignore them. In a room with an ornate door, the group prepares to report what happened. A man informs them that the survivors are being treated in the Academy's medical wing. The director of the World Union Academy, Orodrom Alexandro, thanks them for stopping Varian's illegal experiments. He then questions them about the magic engines Varian possessed. Orodrom shows a document stating that each one is worth more than an entire nation's budget. Professor Ariel agrees, questioning how Varian managed to gather 8 of these devices on his own. Orodrom reveals that the equipment is stolen property. He explains they were stolen during transport, resulting in the loss of 78 agents. The revelation shocks everyone in the room. Ariel then remembers the incident from 15 years ago. The director confirms, stating that the stolen cargo contained those engines and that he remembers who was responsible. Then he reveals the name The Reapers and asks if they've ever heard of them. Gray Lee identifies them as the world's largest criminal organization, and Bella adds that they are parasites who always resurface. The memory visibly affects him. Bella Albright then reveals that they were also responsible for the loss of her parents. Orodrom explains that they can be dismantled, but they always resurface, and no one knows where they hide or who leads them. He adds that some say over 78% of all fatal crime-related incidents are their doing. The director would be surprised if some of their members were already inside the Academy, but it would be impossible to identify them, and the Academy wouldn't act. Gray questions him, not understanding how the Academy wouldn't act even with criminals infiltrated. Ariel explains that's how the Academy works now, giving anyone with talent a chance to grow stronger without distinction. Orodrom Alexandro agrees, stating that to the Academy, it doesn't matter if they are criminals. Bella Albright finds the idea absurd, believing that criminals should be punished. The director says he agrees, but his superiors don't share that view. She questions him, asking if he isn't the director, and he replies that he's just a subordinate. He explains that while he may be the face of the Academy on paper, his authority is insignificant, and asks if they want to know who really calls the shots. Bella and Gray Lee stare at him, waiting for the answer. Then, the director simply advises them to get stronger. He explains that the more power they prove they have, the deeper into the Academy they'll be allowed and the more secrets they'll uncover. Orodrom reveals that, although he can't name names, there is a veteran with the influence to shape the Academy's direction, including the policy of accepting criminals. Gray then asks if they could change the Academy by becoming stronger than this person, and the director confirms that maybe they could. The director concludes by saying that around here, strength is everything. Gray and Bella clench their fists, determined. Orodrum watches them with interest. He knows that Professor Ariel wouldn't have stood a chance against Varian alone. This leads him to conclude that the victory was the work of one of the two students, recognizing that Ariel's divine eye is as sharp as ever. Orodrum Alexandro smiles, saying he can't wait to see what kind of prodigy she's training. Then, Gray Lee walks alone down an academy hallway. He clenches his hand, looking at the mark on his wrist. Gray concludes that power rules the academy, and to take down the executor or uncover its secrets, he needs something. He decides that first he'll have to focus on getting stronger. Suddenly, a student rushes towards him, and Gray just wonders what's going on. The guy hits him with a direct kick. Gray slides across the floor from the force of the impact. He then manages to recover, crossing his arms. The attacker calls him tougher than expected, and Gray asks what his problem is. Indignant, the student repeats the question. He accuses Gray of walking around like he owns the place and states that a special admission reject doesn't belong in this hallway. Gray then asks if he's looking for a fight, noting it's the first time someone has actually hit him in the hallway. The guy says he'd love to, but gestures with his hand. As he turns, Gray sees that Professor Ariel has appeared, and the student calls her Reject Number 2. The student just says, "See ya," and turns to leave down the hall. He apologizes as he walks away, explaining that surveillance prevented him from getting closer. Then, with a defiant smile, he promises he'll send someone else soon. Finally, he speaks Varian's name. Professor Ariel approaches Gray Lee and asks what happened. He explains that some student shoved him, saying a divine eye admittee shouldn't even be walking the halls. She notes that with no weapon and no injuries, there's not much she can do officially. Then Ariel suggests he go after the aggressor and neutralize him. Surprised, the young man asks if he's allowed to do that. The professor explains she can't permit it as his superior, but her eyesight has been poor lately. She might not notice something happening nearby. Gray decides to let it go to avoid more trouble, but she questions his choice. She then asks if the students from the Divine Eye program are bullied that much. The boy clarifies that people make fun of them sometimes, but this is the first time it's gotten physical. She just questions if they really make fun of him. Ariel then apologizes, saying she wishes she had more authority here. But he reassures her, stating that if it weren't for her, he wouldn't even be at the academy. Gray states that he, Bella, and the others will prove the Divine Eye program wasn't a mistake because the professor has a good eye. Elsewhere, Amy White prepares herself, and Bella Albright casts her magic. Meanwhile, Jacob Bloomfield attacks. Professor Ariel remains silent for a moment. Then she thanks Gray, but she warns him not to act like the problem is someone else's. Ariel reveals that out of the entire Divine Eye group, he's the one she expects the most from. She states the others will become top tier, but it was upon meeting him that she believes someone could surpass humanity. Gray replies that's a tough comparison. The professor stares at him intently. He then reflects that the mastermind behind Varian probably hasn't given up on summoning the Liquidator. After all, not even they could damage that thing, and he returned to this timeline to ensure he can defeat it. The fate of this world rests in his hands. The scene shifts to a large coliseum within the city. Later, in a classroom, the professor announces that fencing class will be live combat practice. He instructs the students to pair up according to the list on the board. Gray Lee watches and remarks that he'd better be on his game. He reflects that if he messes up, everyone will start bad-mouthing the Divine Eye admittees again, so he needs to at least show he can keep up with the regular students. The young man reacts to his own conclusion. Then the board reveals his partner is Leonhardt Apias. Leonhardt is the top student in the fencing course and the strongest first year. The professor claims he tried to pair students of similar skill levels and asks them to treat the fight as if it were real. Gray questions the similar skill levels, wondering how he, a special admittee, ended up fighting the top student. He also figures his opponent already dislikes the Divine Eye students and is probably eager to take him down after the last incident. Suddenly, Leonhardt greets him from behind. He remarks that they seem to be partners and he's thrilled, since becoming the top of the class was worth it to be able to fight Lord Gray. Leonhardt steps closer, declaring he's trained harder than anyone and asks Gray to witness his true swordsmanship. Gray reacts to his sparring partner's intensity. He realizes the smile is there because he's relishing the chance to finally defeat him in an official match. In the middle of the arena, the instructor asks if everyone is ready. He then yells for them to begin. Leonhardt charges forward, shouting, "Here I come." Gray blocks Leonhardt's first strike, their swords clashing. He struggles to withstand the pressure of the attack. Leonhardt pushes him back with a powerful blow. The swordsman focuses for the next move. He unleashes another attack, which Gray manages to parry. The boy holds his sword with both hands to resist the force. Leonhardt comments that his opponent is strong and that it's hard to believe he didn't get in through normal admission. Gray defends himself from multiple simultaneous attacks. Gray thinks that although he's holding his own, he can't match his opponent's strength even using both arms. He realizes Leonhardt's swordsmanship is a standard style, but it's been honed to an impressive level. The swordsman takes a step forward. Gray concludes that for someone in their first life, he's formidable. The fight continues across the arena with several students in combat. A spectator comments that Gray is actually keeping up with Leonhardt, and that it's amazing. Leonhardt declares he could do this all day, but Gray's stamina can't keep up. He reflects that if it weren't for Professor Heathcote's training, he'd already be on the ground. The young man wonders why his opponent isn't even out of breath. Realizing he's running out of breath quickly, Gray decides he needs to end the fight now. He remembers the professor told them to fight like it was real. His expression changes. Leonhardt raises his sword for a final blow, but Gray dodges the attack, leaning back. He plants a hand on the ground for balance. Leonhardt reacts, surprised by the move. Then, from his low stance, Gray lands a strike on his opponent's leg. Leonhardt stumbles midair, wondering what happened. Gray watches him from the ground. Then, Leonhardt realizes his opponent is treating this as a very serious battle. But he tightens his grip on his sword and declares that he can't afford to lose. The next moment, Gray is standing over Leonhardt, who is on the ground with a sword pointed at him. The tip of the blade signals the end of the duel. Then the young man extends his hand and says it was a draw. Leonhardt accepts the help to get up, but states that's not quite right. He explains that at the last moment, all he could do was swing his sword. Gray, on the other hand, could have finished the fight decisively if he had wanted to. Leonhardt concludes that since it was a mock battle, he forced himself to aim for a vulnerable spot and asks if he's wrong. Gray replies that even with protection spells, aiming for vital points in a practiced duel is wrong. With that, Leonhardt declares that it still means he lost. Leonhardt thanks him, saying he finally understands the difference between real combat and swordsmanship, and that fighting isn't just about sword skills. Gray admits it was a rather unexpected move for a fencing class, but Leonhardt retorts that the instructor told them to treat it as real combat, and there's no wrong tactic in a real fight. Then he takes a step forward. He then challenges Gray to another round. Gray wonders if they're really going to fight again. He reflects that he only won by catching him off guard, and that in a direct confrontation, Leonhardt's technique would have put him on the ground. Suddenly, a voice tells them to stop right there. A student approaches and says that combat training or not, no one said they could use anything other than a sword. He questions how a special admission student like Gray got paired with the top student and tells him not to get cocky. Gray just reflects that he wasn't the one who chose the pairing. Leonhardt steps in, stating the professor decided he was the only one worthy of fighting Gray and tells the other student to stay out of it. The professor approaches and confirms that he made the pairs, matching students with similar overall strength. He states that Gray is the only one who can face Leonhardt. The professor then challenges the dissatisfied student to try for himself, saying that if he beats Gray, he can be Leonhardt's opponent. The student simply replies that it's fine by him. He boasts about beating the examiner to get in and says not to compare him to someone who barely passed. Leonhardt reflects that the newcomer is judging Gray by his admission category without knowing his strength, which reminds him of how he used to be. Gray considers that honestly, this is a good chance for his partner's power to be recognized. But Leonhardt turns to the challenger and thinks that more importantly, he interrupted his time with Lord Gray. The student watches him. Then Leonhardt states that for this interruption alone, he deserves a harsh lesson. The newcomer wonders why he got so angry. The professor intervenes, saying that if he doesn't like the real combat rule, they can use only swords, and asks if Gray agrees. Gray reflects that he has no idea of his opponent's strength, but he knows it won't be easy if he passed the regular exams. He acknowledges that his opponent has more stamina and strength, and that not even his intense training can overcome years of proper conditioning. So he says he's not confident in his abilities, but asks if there will be any consequences if he loses. The professor confirms it's just a class exercise, but instructs them not to go easy on each other. Gray agrees, and both fighters prepare for combat. The instructor gives the signal to start, and the student immediately charges forward. The student yells that it's time to put the special admission student in his place, and that he needs to learn his role. Gray blocks his opponent's strike with his sword. He wonders about something. The two blades press against each other. With the impact, a challenger is thrown backward. The challenger reacts with surprise, while Gray realizes the blow was light and his power is nothing special. The student charges forward to attack again. Then Gray wonders if his opponent is holding back. With a single move, he disarms his adversary. The student falls to the ground from the impact of the blow. The professor declares the fight is over. Gray approaches and asks if he's okay, thinking he expected him to dodge. The fallen student claims it was luck and that he just caught him off guard. He gets up and demands to fight one more time. The professor tells him to go ahead until he's satisfied. The student attacks Gray again and again. Sometime later, the sky is clear over the arena. Gray approaches the fallen student and asks if he's all right. The boy starts to answer. Visibly exhausted, he claims he's fine. The professor says that's enough and asks someone to take the student to the infirmary. Then, the instructor announces that this year's representatives are Gray and Leon, asking if there are any objections. Gray asks what it means to be representatives. Leonhardt explains that the best of the first years face the second-year champion. The professor adds that it's for the inter-year battle. He points to the students, informing them that the first years have lost 35 times in a row. But the instructor states that maybe this year will be different. Gray wonders about the 35 consecutive losses. He asks if the power gap between the years is really that big. The professor confirms that 1 year at the academy makes a huge difference. The instructor explains that losing is normal, even expected. He continues, saying that just putting up a good fight is impressive enough, and a victory would go down in history as a miracle. Then, he places a hand on Gray's shoulder. The professor tells them not to stress too much and dismisses the class. Gray reflects that the inter-year battle isn't as serious as he imagined, but as a special Divine Eye student, he sees the perfect opportunity to prove he can fight. The young man then decides he needs to train hard. In a faculty meeting, the last item on the agenda is Professor Budra's proposal. Professor Ariel confirms she's listening. Budra, a professor from the magic department, proposes that the Divine Eye student Amy White be expelled. Ariel questions him, stating she's responsible for the Divine Eye students, but he replies that this is the problem. He explains that Amy White failed her third-year advancement exam and only remained because she's a special admission. Budra concludes by asking how that could possibly seem fair, since all the other students who failed were expelled. Ariel defends her student, explaining she's developing a world-class combat ability, but a reaction in her body prevents her from using her full power. A professor scoffs. He says the side effect excuse makes an underperforming student sound like a prodigy, and asks how long she'll keep up this fantasy. She insists it's the truth and that the student could gain full control any day now. But if they push her, she might lose that chance forever. Another professor points out that she's used the same excuse before. He then asks if her plan is to let someone who doesn't meet the Academy's standards stay indefinitely. Ariel argues that the Academy exists to nurture talent. Expelling someone gifted who doesn't fit the system goes against its very purpose. Budra questions her use of the word talent. He remarks that maybe the special picks were impressive back in the day, but the current crop is full of failures. Ariel remembers Amy White, Bella Albright, and Jacob Bloomfield. Another professor suggests the Great Divine Eye is losing its insight, and that perhaps it's time to consider abolishing the program entirely. Surprised, she asks what they are talking about. The professor reminds her that the program was established by the founding council and can be abolished if more than half the faculty agrees. A colleague agrees, saying that current Divine Eye students are not impressive. Another adds he's heard of Bella Albright's improvement, but it's no great achievement and her mana capacity is questionable. Ariel starts to respond. One professor agrees that while past Divine Eye students were impressive, the recent class doesn't have the same impact. Several professors react with scornful smiles. Other faculty members watch with disdain. She realizes there are more voices against the Divine Eye than she thought. At this rate, the program really could be shut down. Budra claims the program has been outdated for a long time and that it's time for them to move on. A colleague taunts her, asking if she still plans to claim she can judge talent better than the rest of them. She clenches her fist, wanting to say yes, but she knows that would only provoke them. Ariel knows they already dislike her. Still, she reflects that many professors care if the program benefits the Academy, and she can't say anything that would turn them against her. Ariel remains silent. Budra asks if the cat's got her tongue, saying at least she knows she's past her prime. Another professor agrees, saying maybe it's time for her to retire before she ruins her legacy. One professor suggests that if she wants to raise her favorite students as she pleases, she should open her own school. A professor calls the idea brilliant and says she'll be lucky to find any students who would follow a decaying Divine Eye. But Ariel states that those kids need more time, and if they get it, they will prove their worth. She concludes that she must stop them from being expelled before that happens at any cost. One of those present then asks about the Divine Eye students, mentioning one named Gray. Another professor comments he's heard Gray is promising among the first-year swordsmanship students and was chosen for the inter-year battle. Budra reacts, commenting that he does indeed sound promising. Then one of them suggests they let him prove his worth in the competition and decide the program's future based on the results. Professor Ariel considers the proposal in silence. She remembers Professor Heathcote Longfellow. Ariel hesitates to give an answer. She begins to explain that Gray's power isn't suited for simulated battles and that in a real life or death situation, a professor slams the table and cuts her off, saying there she goes with the excuses again. He shouts that if a student can't show their power in training, they won't show it in a real fight, and everyone there knows it. Ariel stands up and retorts that they don't understand, as his skills are not normal swordsmanship. Tension fills the faculty meeting room. A senior professor ends the meeting, declaring the discussion is going nowhere. But he states that seeing the Divine Eye admission in action seems reasonable, and that they will decide after his performance in the battle. Ariel tries to object to the decision. As they leave, the other professors comment that they're now looking forward to the competition, as it should be quite a show. Professor Heathcote Longfellow leaves the room in silence. Alone in the room, Ariel remains seated at the table. She apologizes to everyone, stating she is too weak. She then remembers Gray. His power isn't suited for simulated battles, and he still needs time. And she knows what she's hoping for is irrational. Even so, she makes a silent plea. She begs for someone to help them. To help those children, those rough gems with world-class potential, and to protect their future. The day of the inter-year battle finally arrives. In the center of the crowded arena, the start of the event is announced. The announcer introduces the top first-year student, Leonhardt Apias. Next, he introduces the top second-year student, Lunel Hartman. and also the first-year challenger Gray Lee. Finally, the second-year challenger Deeble Redartle is introduced. Gray recognizes him as the guy who confronted him in the hallway and wonders if he's really going to fight him. The announcer declares that everyone will witness what they are capable of. In the audience, many professors watch intently. Among them is Professor Boudra. Leonhardt questions the presence of so many professors, but Lunel Hartman explains that this is a first, since only 3 showed up last year. Lunel wonders why there are so many today, and Leonhardt seems to understand the reason. He concludes that the professors must be curious about Gray and that they certainly have good taste. Lunel wonders if his colleague has always been like this. Then a professor states that their guess is correct as they came to witness the final battle of the special admits of the Divine Eye. The other students in the arena react to the news. Gray questions what they mean by final. One of the professors asks if no one told him. Then Professor Budra announces that the Divine Eye class will be abolished. Shocked, Gray asks Professor Ariel if that's true. She stares at him in silence for a moment. The professor reflects that in his current state, the battle might be too much for him. Then she takes a deep breath to compose herself. Ariel assures him that Budra is just trying to mess with his focus and instructs him to just fight. She remains silent, observing the competitors in the arena. Gray looks at the professor. He turns his face forward. Then the young man replies that he will do as she says. Budra simply tells them to go ahead and embarrass themselves. He thinks that as soon as they lose, the other professors will finally realize that her vision is no longer so sharp. Gray glares at the professors and states that he can't let that slide. Budra questions what he said, but the young man says he doesn't care if they insult him. He then warns him not to dare speak ill of Professor Ariel's judgment. The professor reacts to his statement. Boudra asks what kind of strength her eye saw in him, stating that everyone else is convinced he will lose pathetically. So Gray says fine and that he'll let him prove him wrong. The professor gets annoyed at what he calls an arrogant young man. The announcer asks the participants to separate and go with their teammates. Ariel appreciates his confidence, but she wonders what Gray is planning. She considers that if he were fighting the top student, his practical swordsmanship might give him a small chance, but he has been matched with a terrible opponent. Ariel reveals that Bradley has honed Deeble Redartle's skills, turning him into a living weapon with superhuman reflexes. She concludes that he is the worst possible opponent for Gray's ambush tactics. Then the professor wonders if he is planning to use that skill. Gray glares at the professor's stand. Professor Ariel tells him not to worry about her, but asks him not to push himself too hard. Gray remains silent for a brief moment. Then he replies that he knows. The announcer declares the start of the top students' match, asking the representatives to step forward. He explains that the arena has protective magic and that victory consists of triggering the opponent's safeguard, fighting as if it were real combat. Leonhardt and Lunel Hartman face each other. The announcer then shouts for the top students' match of the inter-year battle to begin. Leonhardt charges forward immediately, yelling that here he comes. Lunel awaits him and tells him to show what he's got. The two swords clash in a swift exchange of blows. The second-year student takes a step back. He then blocks a strong attack from above. Lunel's counterattack throws Leonhardt off balance. He places his hand on the ground to keep from falling. Lunel then lands a hit on his opponent. Leonhardt reflects that he can't fight like Lord Gray. Lunel comments that he's very good, stronger than he himself was in his first year. Then he says to pick up the pace. Lunel challenges him to keep up. They exchange another series of rapid blows. The first-year student is forced to retreat. Leonhardt's protective magic is activated. Lunel prepares for the final blow. The announcer shouts that that's enough. The announcer declares Lunel the winner and the two competitors thank each other for the fight. Next, the start of the challengers match is announced and the representatives are called forward. Leonhardt wishes Gray good luck, who thanks him. The young man reflects that he has talked too much and now needs to back up his words. He remembers facing much greater threats before he went back in time. Compared to that, he believes this fight is winnable. The tip of Deeble Redartle's sword scrapes the arena floor. He tells Professor Bradley to wait just a moment longer as he will ensure his opponent's defeat.